Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining the Aquarium Online Academy. You are tuning in for a class about kelp forests and conservation. So this is really what we're going to be focusing on in this session. Now, my name is Stacy. I'm coming to you from the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California. And I want to actually step out of the frame here to give you a chance to look at this exhibit. Now, this is actually one of the exhibits we have here at the Aquarium of the Pacific called Amber Forest, where we have a lot of our kind of smaller fish. So it is a kelp forest habitat, as you can see by all the seaweed that is present. So I'm going to step off, just take a quick look at it and see what is this kelp all about? Why is it there? How do the animals use it? See if you can figure that out just by watching this exhibit here. And while we do that, we're actually going to also put up the phone number for you to reach us, because you can send us a text message to reach us during our live program here. And that number is right down there. It's 562-286-1838. And if you are someone who needs to ask for permission in order to text, please make sure that you do, because text rates may apply. In addition, if you are not watching this live and you still want to send in your thoughts, your questions, anything you'd like to share, we would love to receive those even if we're not live. So you can get to us by a little bit further down there on the very bottom line. That's our email address. It's live@lbaop.org. So either way, we will get to your questions and make sure that we do send them back. Now, if you do text them in, if you want to add your name to that text too, we can actually say your name during our program here. All right, so we're going to keep that number up, but I also want you to make an observation here. So what do you see? What do you notice when you're observing a kelp forest habitat? I think one of the things that I notice right off the bat is that it actually moves quite a lot. Now, of course, this is an exhibit here at the aquarium, so we have fashioned this exhibit to have a little bit of a surge, so it does kind of sway back and forth. But that's really because that's what a kelp forest basically is like, and that's because kelp needs to have movement of water. That water movement is what's bringing in a lot of the nutrient-rich waters that the kelp needs in order to survive. So kelp looks a whole lot like a plant, right? In fact, it's called a kelp forest because in a lot of ways, it is similar to like a tree forest on land. So this kelp forest here, instead of having plants or trees, this seaweed here, it's a type of algae. And algae and trees are similar in that they take things like nutrients like fertilizers, water, and sunlight, and carbon dioxide, and they mix those things together for photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is then taking all of those components and creating sugars for it to survive, basically energy. So these algae can actually photosynthesize just like land plants can. So it's a very important thing to have in the ocean. It's for a kelp forest ecosystem, it's one of the like kind of bases of the food web in a kelp forest. So you can see here that water movement, right? So again, that's kind of getting some nice nutrient-rich water into the mix. What you can't see, but if you were able to go to one of them, is that you would feel how cool the water is. Now, kelp forests really thrive in cold environments, and we're really lucky here in Southern California to have really a great condition for kelp like the ones that you see right here. So we have water movement, we have lots of sunlight, we also have cool waters, and all of that put together allows this kelp to potentially really thrive. Now, when they're in perfect conditions, kelp can actually grow, giant kelp at least, can actually grow 2 feet in a day. Just imagine that growth, 2 feet in a single day. So that's incredible. Because that's what's going to allow it to not only grow from the ocean floor all the way up to the surface, but did you notice that once it reaches the surface, it actually kind of bends down and kind of creates almost like a canopy. So very similar in a lot of ways to a rainforest. There's this canopy of kelp at the top, and that provides a lot of animals with cover with a place to kind of hide from any predators that might be up in the air, like a bald eagle, for example. Pelicans, too. Those are animals that come from above that can actually eat a small fish. So having this cover like this is going to be really great for those animals. Now, also, the lush cover that you see all around right here is also going to be really great for a lot of animals because there are also predators that live in and among the kelp. And so having it be a little bit darker toward the bottom and having a thick carpet of kelp and other algae and rocks are really great to kind of provide cover there too. So let's look specifically at kelp a little bit more so we understand kind of what its purpose is and how it functions, all right? And in order to do that, we're going to be using my model of kelp here. So this is a model. It isn't the real deal. The real stuff would be a little bit on the slimier side because there is kind of a layer of slime typically on kelp that does protect it. And it would definitely be a lot harder to hold. So this is what kelp more or less looks like, otherwise known as giant kelp. There's lots of other types of kelp out there, but we're going to specifically talk about giant kelp that makes kelp forests. So if you look at the giant kelp here, this is one of the really important parts of it. This is very similar to a leaf, right? It looks like a leaf, but it is, instead of a leaf, it's called a blade. And it does a lot of the similar things to what leaves do. This is where they get a lot of the sunlight. They collect the sunlight in order to photosynthesize. They can also absorb a lot of the nutrients as well as the carbon dioxide that it needs to photosynthesize. So that all happens here in our kelp blades. And you can see how many blades there are as well. Now, another thing you may notice is this thing right here, this little bubble. And if you have ever been lucky enough to go to the beach and actually find kelp on the beach, this is often a thing that people like playing with because if you squish it real hard, it will pop. And that's because it's a gas-filled bladder. So it's this little bubble. It is full of gas. It's a lot like a balloon. And if you put a balloon in water, what does it do? It floats. That's right. And that's exactly why this kelp is not just crumpled up on the bottom of the ocean. It's actually floating up towards the surface because if you look carefully, you can even see some of those little bladders. Okay, so these are like little balloons and they're really great because as this is reaching towards the surface because they want to float, it's allowing these blades to actually get closer to the sun. Pretty good deal, right? Well, these don't want to be independent. It does want to be attached to something, and that's where this comes into play. This is called a stipe, and in some ways, it is very similar to like the branches of a plant, of a tree, except for one thing. Take a look at how the kelp is moving. Do you notice that it sways and bends? So this stipe is quite flexible, and that's really great when you're dealing with surges like this. Now, this is a fairly calm movement of water. Sometimes, especially when we have big storms, this water can move with much more energy, much more force. And so this could potentially break if it was stiff like a branch, right? So having the flexibility is actually really great for it living in this water that's kind of flowing here and there. And then the last part that I want to talk about is actually on the bottom, and you can't really see it too much here in our video, but if you look real far down there, you might be able to see a little bit. That's this thing. Now, again, this is a model, so this is just plastic. It doesn't look exactly like this, but this is what we call a hold fast. And that's exactly what it does. It holds the kelp. It holds it to the ground. Now, there's lots and lots of rocks where kelp lives because it needs those rocks to secure it to the ocean floor. If it doesn't have the rocks down here to secure it to the ocean floor, then it would just float away because it has those little floaty bubbles, right? So having these sorts of things, they almost look branchy themselves, just kind of wrap in and among the rocks. It holds onto those rocks and it It holds it pretty well. Now, sometimes when the storms are strong enough, or maybe something has eaten a lot of the holdfast, so it's not holding quite as well, sometimes the kelp can get dislodged, and then you'll just find it floating on the ocean surface. Now, it doesn't mean it's dead yet, because in plants, that bottom part, those are the roots, and without roots, plants usually don't survive. At least they don't survive very long. For algae, it's different. They don't have roots. That's one of the biggest differences between algae and a plant. So they don't have roots. They don't need roots because remember, it's the blades that are absorbing a lot of the nutrients and the carbon dioxide that it needs to photosynthesize. All right, so this is really just designed to keep it held to the ocean floor. All right. So now that we understand a little bit more about kelp, shall we see how it's used? Now, we were looking a little bit earlier at all of these fish here. What are the fish doing with kelp? Not much. They're really not doing a ton, right? But did you notice that they are kind of more or less hanging around the kelp or hanging out near rocks? That sort of behavior allows them to have a place to hide. So just like we were saying with that kelp forest, when it's real dense, when there's a lot of kelp growing, it gives these animals a really great place to hide. Now, this is part of our food web, right? You need to have all these fish in this ocean environment in order to have the food web. We also even have a shark here. And the kelp is actually part of this web. Now, it is not the only producer in a kelp forest. So kelp is not the only thing that is photosynthesizing. There is also going to be microscopic algae or phytoplankton. So it's plankton. It is microscopic plankton floating around in the water, and that's also part of the food web that is a kelp forest. So have you ever been to the oceans kind of nearby Long Beach, and you look and you're like, man, that water sure is green. It looks dirty. Well, that green is actually caused by all this algae here. So this is good stuff. We want this. Remember, it's part of the food web. It's also using up carbon dioxide, which is real good. We want that. And it's also providing food. Well, what eats these? Other microscopic things. In fact, there are some microscopic animals out there called zooplankton, and they eat those phytoplankton there. So all of that is kind of happening in a kelp forest. And then you kind of keep moving up from there. There's a lot of shellfish like oysters and clams and mussels, those sorts of things that filter plankton out of water as well. Now, one of my favorite animals that I want to talk about for a little bit may not be an animal that seems like it would be a favorite for a lot of people because it's a snail. But trust me, it is a very charismatic snail. This snail is called an abalone, and abalone are definitely snails. Take a look. Do you see that? Well, it kind of looks like a bunch of rocks piled on top of other rocks, right? But that's exactly what they do. They look like rocks. Why do you think they look like rocks? Is there a benefit? Absolutely. That benefit is actually going to hide them, right? It's a form of camouflage. If you look like a rock, you're less likely to get eaten. And here at the aquarium, a lot of our abalone are actually quite clean. If you were to see these abalone in the ocean, they're covered in algae, they're covered in barnacles. There's just all kinds of stuff growing on them. So they really look like rocks. But this here is one of the abalone. So you can see this shell. And then if you look carefully against the big rock there, do you see that kind of black foot there? That is what they use to stick onto those rocks. So they have a squishy body, and that squishy body is covered by a shell, and they wear their shell like a hat. And that's basically how they survive. And then you can see here all those little kind of tentacly looking things. That's going to help them sense their world. Now this abalone here is different from this abalone here. Did you know that? Did you know that off the top of your head? Like, did you see that and go, oh man, I definitely see two types of abalone here in this picture. It's kind of tough, right? They do look real similar because they have that shell that looks like a rock. But take a look at its body. Do you see how it's a different color? So this here is a white abalone, And this one up here is a red abalone. Now, I know you're probably like, oh, that's a black abalone because it has a black body. It's a little bit different. It's called a red abalone. Or, yeah, it is called a red abalone. There are black abalone out there too. Their shells are actually more of a black color. And so their body and shell are black colored, and that's why they're the black abalone. The red abalone here has the black squishy body, but the shell is actually a little bit redder. Now, these abalone shells don't look very impressive from the outside, but on the inside, they're beautiful. Shall we go take a look? We actually have a handful of abalone shells on my document camera surface here for us to kind of take a look. So this is a white abalone, and this is the white abalone shell. And something you may notice as I zoom in here, you might notice that this shell actually has a little number. And that's because the white abalone that we have here, they're part of a breeding program. This breeding program is designed to have the aquarium here, as well as other organizations, breed white abalone, raise them up a little bit, and then eventually release them in the ocean. Now, one of the reasons why we need to do that is because, did you know that abalone are endangered? There's actually not that many of them out there in the ocean, especially along the California coast, and especially white abalone like the one you see here. So we do actually mark each of our adult, actually, I think all of the white abalone are marked with a little number. And that number allows us to keep records, like how much is it eating? How fast is it growing? Also to know which ones were bred together to get baby abalone. So that's what this number is all about. And the other thing that you'll notice is that we're just looking at the backside. So rock, yes? Okay, now let's flip it over and take a look on the inside. Now, for those of you who were unfamiliar with abalone, this may actually look like a familiar thing. This is mother of pearl. So a lot of jewelry places and even like on decorative boxes and stuff use mother of pearl, and this is where it's from. It's actually from the inside of an abalone. So the body of the abalone would be touching this right here. It'd actually be connected to this part of the shell, and so you wouldn't normally see this in a live abalone. So this again is a white abalone, but isn't it gorgeous? I just love it. Now, something you might be noticing now that we're kind of tipping this around and stuff, do you notice those holes? Well, those holes are pretty important. That's actually where they go to the bathroom. It's also where they release their egg and sperm from. So wait, how do abalone have babies anyways? Well, I actually have a life cycle here that's kind of fun to see. They go through kind of a lot of metamorphosis, actually. So what we have here is a male and a female abalone. Okay, they release their sperm and ovum into the water, and that just kind of mixes together in order to get fertilized, and then you get these little babies. Now, these little babies are super, super, super tiny. I mean, itty bitty teeny tiny. They are microscopic. And so you see these little babies and they're floating around in the water. They eventually start to kind of change a little bit. So you can see how they already start to kind of metamorphise a little bit there. So they're starting to change the way they look, right? But they're still just floating around in the water. And then eventually they get big enough that they start to settle and they start looking a little bit more like their adult counterpart. Now, these little babies here are still so tiny you can't really see them. In fact, when we first have these and they start settling into these big troughs of algae, so we don't throw the kelp in there yet. There's just basically a trough, a water trough that has algae growing in the trough. And so it's real short algae. You know that you have babies when you start to see little circles of no algae among a carpet of algae. So little circles of white where you can just see the trough and no algae means that you have a little baby there that's eating, just like little bit of eating here and there. And so that's how you know you're really just looking for little circles of no algae at all. And then eventually they get big enough where you can see them, but they're like the size of a grain of rice when you can see it. So they're still itty bitty. It takes them quite a long time, years in fact, to grow to be a larger abalone like this. Now, these animals are part of a kelp forest. We need abalone in a kelp forest because they're kind of part of the larger whole. They're part of that food web. Now, they do eat kelp. In fact, it's one of their favorite meals, and it's incredibly important for them to eat this kelp. They're kind of helping to mow down some of the algae so that way more algae can grow. They're like the gardeners of the ocean. The other thing, too, is they provide food for a lot of the animals that live in a kelp forest. So what eats an abalone? Well, one of people's favorite animals in a kelp forest, the sea otter. Sea otters are great abalone hunters. And sea otters, too, are an endangered species. Actually, I think they may have recently been taken off in the endangered list and are now threatened, but I'm not 100% positive. So there aren't very many of them. In fact, their numbers really, really plummeted because of the fur trade back in the 1800s. But they have since been protected and their numbers have increased. We've hit a plateau. We're not really increasing quite as much anymore, but at least we are seeing some otters out in the ocean. Now, we don't have them here in Long Beach. They're really found in central California. Those are the southern sea otters. And then you do find sea otters much further north as well, like in Alaska. So you're going to find a few different populations of sea otters. In Southern California, in Central California, like around Monterey, for example, those are called the southern sea otters. And that's what we have right here. That's also what we house here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. We have southern sea otters. Now, these sea otters eat a lot of different things. They're actually real good eaters. But one of their favorite things is abalone. And in fact, a study was done that looked at otters and their diet, and they found that the otters who eat a lot of abalone tend to be a lot healthier. And that's because, just think about this, that abalone, right? That shell with that squishy body underneath, one abalone is actually a lot of food, as opposed to something like a clam. A clam has a little bit of meat, like that. Abalone is going to be much, much bigger. So for the effort they have to put in to go fish for something like this, it takes more effort to eat a whole bunch of clams than to eat an abalone. Also, I think what the abalone is made of is even healthier for an otter than what a clam is made of. Well, thankfully, even though abalone aren't doing so hot, our otters are still finding some food out there because their diet is quite diverse. They eat a lot of different things. In fact, I feel like a lot of the videos that we have of sea otters here are eating. They're big time eaters. They can eat up to 25% of their body weight in seafood every day. So just think about that, 25%. That means if you weighed 100 pounds, you would eat 25 pounds of food every day. That's incredible how much they eat. Is this a question about otters? Okay, cool. I have a question about otters. How much do otters weigh? Well, southern sea otters are smaller than their northern counterparts. Southern sea otters, on average, the males are about 65 pounds, so they're a little bit bigger. The females are closer to like the 45-pound range or so. Okay, so they're not huge. They're actually quite small. They're the smallest marine mammal out there. But just think, 25% of that every day in seafood. So we know that they eat abalone. We know that they eat clam. They also eat things like shrimp, like mussels, crabs. That's another really good one. Oh, octopuses. I've seen them definitely eat octopuses. And they eat sea urchins. In fact, some of them, their favorite food is sea urchins. Now, this is what a sea urchin looks like. And you can see based on this picture that sea urchins are from a kelp forest. In fact, sea urchins love to eat kelp. They love to eat kelp so much that if their population isn't in check, if you have too many of these purple urchins and red urchins around, they can eat so much kelp that the kelp kind of disappears. Now, they're not eating the whole thing of the kelp. Do you remember the holdfast, that bottom of the kelp that we were talking about? So remember, this is the part that's attached to the rocks, okay? And if you look at this animal here, Do you think it swims or do you think it crawls? Just by observing it, just by looking at this picture. It's a crawler, right? No fins. So this is an animal that crawls along the ocean floor. So the part that it can reach is whatever's touching the ocean floor. Well, this is the part that touches the ocean floor. And sometimes they eat so many of these that it really isn't held anymore to that rock. So if it's not held anymore, it's going to break free and just float in the ocean, just like we were talking about earlier. Well, when that happens to one, that's not a big deal. If it happens to a lot of the kelp, that's a real big deal. In fact, it's a whole lot like clear cutting a forest. So these urchins, they don't know this is what's happening. They're just hungry and they're going to eat. And so when you have a lot of these urchins around, they can take out an entire kelp forest. It's what we call an Urchin Barren. So having otters around to eat 25% of their body weight in animals like an urchin is actually a really good thing. We're not going to get too many urchins if the otters are there eating them. In fact, some otters, their favorite food are these purple urchins, and their teeth even get stained purple. That's how much they love to eat purple urchins. So otters are really important to have around to keep urchins in check. We still want urchins to be around too. We don't want them to disappear. They're part of this ecosystem. We just need them to be in balance. And that's really where the importance lies. We need to have an ocean that is in balance with the rest of the ocean. So what do we do then? How can we protect a place like a kelp forest? Well, some of what's going on is stuff like what the aquarium is doing, like trying to breed those abalone. So that way the abalone are part of the ecosystem. They're going to be back in that balance again. Another thing that there are other organizations that are working on breeding the kelp itself. So trying to grow kelp in an aquarium, and then when it's big enough, they go and they plant it out in the ocean, and that's pretty cool too. But what about us, right? We can't do that sort of stuff every day. Well, there are a few things you can do. Now, remember how we talked about kelp and how kelp loves cold water? Well, as our oceans are warming, that's not so good for our kelp. In fact, it's really stressful, and a lot of our kelp isn't growing as well anymore. So we can help by keeping our brains on climate change. We want to try to not have so much carbon dioxide that we are creating in the atmosphere. Now, the carbon dioxide I'm talking about is not what you're breathing out. That's natural carbon dioxide. That's kind of part of life. What I'm talking about is called rampant carbon dioxide, and that is caused by burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gasoline. So things like driving a car or turning on your lights at home, that's all energy that's created by using a fossil fuel. So the more energy we use, the more carbon dioxide that there will be in the air. And if we get too much of it, the carbon dioxide basically acts like a blanket that's wrapped around our planet, and it warms the planet. But it's a blanket that the planet can't kick off. And so we need to do our part by trying to use less energy. Less of that rampant carbon dioxide then will go into the air. So that's something that we can do pretty easily, right? Things like turning off a light when you don't need it, or maybe using less stuff. For example, like even like a water bottle. Instead of getting a plastic water bottle, drinking it and throwing it in recycling, then getting another one, drinking it and throwing it in recycling, what about getting a reusable water bottle that you can fill with water, drink, and then fill with water and drink again? Did you know that energy is used to make things like water bottles? So recycling is good. Recycling is better than throwing away, but it's still using more stuff, right? So using less stuff is a good idea. If you can do that, that's great. The other thing too is that there's these places in our ocean called marine protected areas. They're special places kind of like a national park is on land, where it is protected. And this protected area then can be really, really healthy, maybe, even like something that you're seeing right here. So many different types of fish, lots and lots of algae, even things like abalone and urchins and other kinds of invertebrates like sea stars. And all of those things can work together in balance and be a healthy section of the ocean. If it's real healthy there, maybe they can even spill over into other parts of the ocean too. So supporting things like marine protected areas is a really good idea, and it's a really great way to actually help our kelp forests and these giant fish that you see behind me. And it's getting closer, so it looks like it's getting bigger. Now this giant fish, oh, there's one back there so you can see it a little bit easier. This enormous fish body is the body of a giant sea bass. And it sure does look giant from this perspective, doesn't it? So these giant sea bass are really, really big fish that you would find in a kelp forest. And they live similar to people by number of years. So we're talking about like 70 years of life. So we want to protect these kelp forests so that way these fish have a place to live and grow and be enormous, right? Because they're all part of that balance that we need in a kelp forest. So I hope that you enjoyed learning about kelp forests. They're really incredible places. And you know, this is actually a camera that you can check out on your own if it's something that you're interested in. This is our blue cavern exhibit. You'll see that these are the highlights. So that's usually when the fish are real close to the camera, is at night. But you can see some of our highlights there. You can also see when the fish isn't in front of the camera. You can see all the other life that we have inside Blue Cavern too. All you need to do is go to our website, aquariumofpacific.org, and look up our webcams. And then you too can take a look at a giant fish body and more. All right. Thanks everybody for joining our kelp forest and conservation program. We do have one more program coming up in just about 29 minutes. And we'll see you then. All right. Bye.